The BYD Seal is a car that we like a lot. And it seems a lot of Malaysians seem to do so as well, because last month they sold over 100 units of these alone, giving rise to the fact that maybe saloons aren't dead after all. And so to capitalize on this success, BYD Malaysia via its distributor Sime Darby Motors has introduced another variant to the Seal lineup, making it even more attractively priced than ever before. And we're here to find out if the base Seal Dynamic is worth your money. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, this is our review of the BYD Seal Dynamic. Now this Seal Dynamic is about 16,000 ringgit more affordable than the next step up, which is the BYD Seal Premium, and about 30 plus thousand ringgit more affordable than the BYD Seal all-wheel drive. And the main differentiator actually comes from what's under the skin. So gone is the very large LFP battery pack. In its place is a 55 kilowatt hour battery pack mated to a slightly smaller electric motor over the rear axle. As a result, this car has about 201 horsepower and 310 Newton meters of torque, making this a little bit slower than the next step up, which is again the BYD Seal Premium. Now that isn't really that bad, because this is more than enough power on tap, and more importantly it actually shares its components with the BYD Atto 3 as well as the BYD Dolphin, which means that theoretically spare parts for the powertrain ought to be a little bit more affordable. Now, while range and performance does take a little bit of a hit, it's not just that, because charging has also been dialed down a little bit for this entry-level model. AC charging remains identical at 7 kilowatts, which is the same as the rest of the BYD Seal range. However, AC charging is a little bit slower at 110 kilowatts rather than 150 kilowatts. However, because this battery pack is smaller, that does mean that the DC charging speed from 10 to 80% remains identical with the other models, and so it's not so bad once you consider everything. The other place it takes a hit is in terms of rolling stock, because these are 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in GT Comfort 225 tires, as opposed to the higher performance tires and 19-inch alloy wheels that you get on the Seal Premium and the Seal Performance. However, otherwise, specifications on this car remain identical, which means that you get full LED headlights up front, replete with automatic high beam. You still get an NFC card reader up here for the alternative entry method into this car. You still get flush door handles should you want them, as well as a particularly long wheelbase. So even though the BYD Seal is about the same size as a Honda Civic or a Toyota Corolla Altis, you actually get more space back here that is more akin to a D-segment saloon. As we move further back, you'll find the charge ports here on the driver's side, as well as this fastback-like profile, which I think still looks good today, particularly in this blacked out paintwork. The only thing that I'm not a big fan of is the fact that these are not frameless doors. However, as I will clarify a little bit later, there is a very good reason why these are not frameless, and that actually pays in terms of NVH. And at the rear, it is broadly the same story, because you still get full LED taillights replete with a gorgeous LED light bar that stretches from one end all the way to the other. You still get the full rear diffuser, which I'm still pretty sure does absolutely nothing. And because of that fastback-like profile, you get this very pert rear end with this sort of built-in ducktail spoiler, which I think looks quite good. However, with the Seal Dynamic, we still have the same problems that we had with the rest of the Seal and generally BYD range, and that is over-badging. Because you have BYD here, and then you have BYD here, as well as the model nomenclature. This is not necessary. Now, underneath the boot, you will find, or rather boot lid, you will find a pretty good amount of space. The BYD Seal is easily one of the most practical C-segment saloons out there, EV or otherwise. And this is because not only is the boot itself very large, it's also a very small lip, and the opening is very wide and very square, which means it's very easy to get things in and out. You also have a sizable amount of space underneath the boot floor, even though this is a rear-wheel drive car, which is plenty large enough for you to hide the charging cables, etc., without having to tie them up in a particularly neat manner. And of course, if you need even more room, you can actually fold the rear seat 60-40 for added practicality. That said, however, you will find that your boot space is impeded by the standard fit manual sunshade. Now, I find this very annoying, and I'm probably going to have a rant about this in about 30 seconds once I get inside. But that aside, this boot remains very practical, making this a consummate family car, even though it's not an SUV. Now, inside the Seal Dynamic, you'd be hard-pressed to figure out where they've saved any money. Because from where I'm sat, the only two things that are not available in here are the heads-up display, which you get on the Seal Premium and Seal Performance, as well as the upholstery, although even that is a bit of a stretch. The Seal Dynamic is the only Seal in the lineup to get faux leather, whereas the Performance and Premium models actually get real leather seats instead. However, they still remain perforated and offer ventilation, which means it's still very comfortable, although I have noticed that in this driver's seat, I've suddenly lost lumbar support. That said, however, everything else in here remains identical to the rest of the lineup, and that starts with this 15-plus-inch screen that rotates should you so want to. It offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which pairs very well with the twin wireless chargers here up front, although there are USB ports and a 12-volt socket down there should you want it. I also get a huge instrument cluster up here, or at least huge in terms of BYD standards, which gives me enough space to actually read all the information that I need, and it's displayed in a way that's very easy for me to understand at a single glance, which I appreciate enormously. On top of that, this steering wheel has also not gone the route of other car makers where they've gone with touch-sensitive buttons on either spoke in order to control various functionalities. Instead, these are nice physical buttons which are nice to use and nice to hold, which is just nice. And on top of that, the steering wheel is also very adjustable, which means that it's very easy for you to find a comfortable driving position, in addition to the powered front seats that I mentioned earlier. Now, in terms of practicality, as I mentioned, I've got a couple of wireless chargers up here, the USB ports and 12-volt socket down there, but there's also more space here should I want to put in more things. There's also a dual-level cup holder here, which is big enough for even a large bottle like this, and if you have a taller bottle, you can actually sink the driver's side cup holder for you to accommodate such bottles. You have an NFC card reader up here for that alternative entry method that I mentioned earlier, as well as a very large center console bin. Now, this is felt lined around the side and rubber lined on the bottom, which means that stuff that you put in here are not about to rattle about and ruin the serenity of your cabin, which I appreciate hugely, although there are no air conditioning vents in here to keep things cool. Now, beyond that, we also have a decently sized glove box here, certainly large enough for you to hold the owner's manual, although I'm pretty sure a physical one doesn't come with this car, as well as very large door bins big enough for a litre-sized bottle. Now, onto the things that I cannot stand. Firstly, the air conditioning vents in this car remain an automatic or electronic affair, which means that I have to go into the air conditioning menu and then faff about with the air conditioning direction in order to get it to blow at my face or away from my face. This is particularly annoying when you have passengers, for example, who don't like the air conditioning blowing in their face, which means that they have to go into this menu in order to adjust their vents. I say this is irritating because if you have Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, which by the way can only be displayed in landscape mode, it will completely remove that screen, and so you will not know which direction you're supposed to travel until they're done faffing about with their air conditioning. And then comes the matter of the standard fit glass roof. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this car does have a manual sunshade that lives in the boot, but that actually exacerbates the problem. Now, with a car like this, if you have an electronic sunblind, it will eat into headroom either at the front or the rear. Now, most cars will have the sunshade that rolls towards the rear, which means that rear headroom is slightly impacted, but BMW have gotten over this by having it roll towards the front, where it doesn't impact the driver's view all that much. The problem is, in the BYD Seal, you are not given such option. Instead, you have to choose at the beginning of the day, perhaps, whether you want the sunshade on or not. This is particularly annoying when you have weather seasons like we're in right now, where perhaps you may want the glass roof open and available to you when you're stuck in a traffic jam driving to work, but then you want it shut during the harshness of the afternoon sun when you're out for lunch with your colleagues in the car before the tops of their heads start to cook. Now, because of that, again, you have to make that decision. I think that's not a decision that one should have to make, even if you're buying the entry-level BYD Seal at 160,000 ringgit. That said, however, it does claw some points back by offering, again, the identical Dyne audio system that we've seen in other BYD Seal variants, which is absolutely excellent, as well as the 64-color ambient lighting system in this car, which is very good. On top of that, material quality overall in here is very good. You'd be very hard-pressed to find hard plastics, at least beyond the center console, because everything here is lovely and soft touch, and there's even a touch of Alcantara-like material, which I think is some microfiber, faux microfiber material, which I think looks good, feels good, and really does raise the sense of premiumness and upmarketness within this cabin. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the BYD Seal has an unusually long wheelbase within C-segment contenders, which means that inside you have acres of space. So for example, sat back here with the front seat set in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have acres of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom, no doubt from the sacrificing of the electric sunshade. But what that means is I have a lot of space to stretch out back here. And as you can see with my feet set up like this, I don't have that much under thigh support, but I can very easily stretch my feet out in front of me in order to make full use of the cushioning beneath them. That said, with the front seat, again, set up in my driving position, I don't even have to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me because there is that much legroom, which means that this is easily comparable to a D-segment saloon in terms of cabin or rear cabin space. Now, aside from that, these seats are also very comfortable because they are angled ever so slightly in order to provide better support for your thighs, as well as to get you into a more comfortable position for your backrest. There are 3 individual headrests here, which I appreciate hugely, which means I can adjust this headrest to a position that I'm most comfortable in. And because the floor is flat, that does mean that if you have to sit 3 abreast, while the fella in the middle will be a little bit perched higher than most people, and so headroom becomes a little bit of a problem. Footroom shouldn't be an issue because the floor in this car is completely flat. However, if you only have 2 passengers back here, you will appreciate the fact that there are 2 ISOFIX mounts in the rear as well as 1 ISOFIX mount in the front, which means that if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, you have the option of mounting that in the front seat in order to allow a passenger, an adult passenger, to sit in the rear more comfortably. And as for going back to amenities back here, rather, I still have a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders, and I like the fact that it floats like this as opposed to some cars where they just flop down, which I think always feels a little bit cheap. I've got a couple of crotch coolers in the center, as well as a little bit of a space for things. And there's also a USB-A and USB-C port hiding behind a cover in the center console itself, which means that you have the option to charge devices should you so want to. Beyond that, I've got a couple of small cubby holes behind the rear seat and one larger one for larger items. I've also got decently sized door bins, big enough for maybe a half-liter to liter sized bottle, although that will be a little bit of a squeeze, as well as a small pocket up here for smaller items. And if I were to be sat here again as one of 2 passengers sat in the rear, I can very easily cross my legs without touching the seats in front of me, and I still remain very comfortable indeed, which means that the BYD Seal could actually serve pretty well as a chauffeur-driven vehicle for company car buyers or fleet owners, etc. Now, the thing about the BYD Seal Dynamic is that it's very clear that this car's cost-cutting measures in order to hit this particularly attractive price point have not occurred in terms of overall specification. Because as far as I can tell, being sat in here, it feels just as upmarket as the rest of the Seal lineup. But given the fact there is less power and less range and smaller wheels, does that also mean that this car is slightly less fun to drive? Well, the short answer is no. Because while on paper, yes, you may see that this Seal Dynamic has a little bit less power, a little bit less torque, and therefore maybe less fun to drive than the Seal Premium and Seal Performance, from behind the wheel, this just feels like a Seal. And so, for starters, I get an excellent driving position. I have pretty good visibility all the way around, although obviously over the shoulder is a little bit compromised. But then again, tell me which C-segment saloon isn't exactly the same. And life here is pretty pleasant. The NVH levels in this car are excellent. So even though this car runs on GT tires, which are obviously not as high performance or nearly as premium as what you get from the higher end variants, they're still decently quiet. And on top of that, even though in terms of overall performance they're not as good as what you get from certain higher end brands, it's still more than enough for this car, plus the 201 horsepower and 310 Newton meters that it has to offer. And because it doesn't kick up that much in terms of road noise, especially either in the dry or in the wet, you'll be able to appreciate the fact they do have a pretty decent amount of dry weather performance, which is mostly what you want. And in the wet, they're not bad. And even though this is the entry-level Seal, you still get excellent NVH. And so all the windows, for example, are dual pane, which means you get even less noise ingress, which is even better. And because this car gets all of the same features that you get, or the feature set that you get from higher end variants, it just means that it's just a very Seal-like experience. Now, in terms of the dynamics itself, this particular variant doesn't feel any better or worse than the others. You don't get the active frequency dampers that you would in the Performance, fine, but it still drives the same level of confidence and the same level of assuredness that you get from the Seal Premium, which means that this is a pretty good place to be. It doesn't matter if you're just munching miles on the motorway or if you're actually attacking a back road for some bizarre reason, but this car will generally keep up. And the steering, although it's completely devoid of feel and any sort of reaction and response, at the very least, it is very quick to respond to inputs and it weights up in a very natural fashion. So because of the accuracy, it doesn't mean that you're left guessing where the wheels are or what they're doing. You kind of broadly know what they're up to from this steering wheel, which is certainly a good thing. I apologize for that noise because that appears to be my Android Auto. Now, on that note, admittedly, when you're trying to exit out of a corner, if you're driving enthusiastically, you may then notice the 50 Newton meter deficit between this and the premium model. But this has been something of an argument between the Malaysian Motoring team and I, the rest of the team and I, because I contend that this actually has enough performance. Yes, it would be nice to have more torque, but it's not strictly necessary. And the same goes for the power, because this is more than enough for you to do the daily grind, go back and forth to work and home and whatever, as well as taking a few long distance trips if you need to. And on top of that, because this car uses the smaller motor paired to the smaller battery, it does mean that you still get decent range, just under 500 kilometers on a single charge if you're careful. In fact, with this car, with my driving, I've been able to see a estimated range of about 480 kilometers on a charge, which is certainly good for a car like this, because it means that, for example, you can get away with only AC charging it once a week. Or in fact, if you're like me and you have no option to AC charge at home, you can DC charge it once a week to achieve the same effect. Overall, it just feels that this car is very, very well put together, and it is a very thoughtful way of being packaged, because it's got all the features in it that you need and nothing more than that. And it's got things like the Dyne audio system. You've still got the fantastic ADAS functions, etc., which just make it much, much more appealing. Now, on the ADAS functionality, if you want to hear a little bit more in depth about that, you can actually check out our older BYD Seal videos, because it is broadly the same affair. But on that, I will just mention the fact that this feels like a very mature system, and therefore it is something that you can rely on a day-to-day basis, particularly when you're stuck in traffic, etc., because the car does a pretty decent job. And because it relies on not just a camera, but it uses a camera and radar-based system, it also means that even in hirsute weather conditions, like what we're dealing with right now, the car will still maintain visibility and therefore maintain functionality when you're stuck in traffic in crappy weather like what we're experiencing today. Now, when you put all of that together between the NVH package, the performance on offer, as well as, again, that price point of well under 170,000 ringgit, the BYD Seal Dynamic just makes a lot of sense. Now, I am someone who is a huge fan of the BYD Seal Premium because I like rear-wheel drive vehicles generally, and I feel that that package plus that battery means that you have really usable range, about 600 kilometers I found on my testing, between 570 and 600 depending on your driving style, which means that, again, that is a car that you can get away with charging once a week. But for those of you who really do not travel out of town on a regular basis, and if you do, why the hell are you looking at an EV in the first place? But if you are just looking for a town car and you're really taken with the Seal package, then this is something that makes a lot of sense. Yes, you miss out on the fancy wheels. Yes, you don't have the heads-up display, but these are two things that don't really make that much of a difference. And in terms of the seat upholstery, yeah, sure, this may be faux leather, but it feels just as good as a genuine leather, which either speaks to the quality of the faux leather or the lack of quality in the real one. But either way, I think that this is a really well set up car. For 160-odd thousand ringgit, it's very hard to find a vehicle that can beat this, particularly given the fact that even in this entry-level trim, in terms of performance, this well outdoes vehicles like the Honda Civic Turbo as well as the Toyota Corolla Altis. That said, however, if you're in the market for something within this sort of size category and you're looking for something that drives particularly well, then consider the aforementioned Toyota Corolla Altis, particularly in GR Sport guise, because I still maintain that is one of the best handling vehicles within this segment. If you want something that is just as premium but has an internal combustion motor, then consider the Mazda 3 Saloon, because that 2-litre engine is pretty efficient by all regards, and that interior just feels a little bit more upmarket compared to this if you understand what premium means, and at least beyond just having a very large screen. But ultimately, I do think that the BYD Seal Dynamic that we have here represents excellent value. Again, at under 170 grand, with the amount of space on offer, I mean, this is a sort of cabin space you used to have to expect from like a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord, which means that if you're buying this to drive yourself as a family car, you will find there's plenty of space for people and things. And more importantly, if you're a potential fleet car buyer, if you're looking for a new company car to be chauffeured to work in every day, you'd be surprised at just how capable this car is. And because it's electric, that should mean you win some benefits in terms of ESG if your company is large enough to demand that. Initially, I thought this car was introduced in order to push people into the mid-range premium model. But in actual fact, I find that this car stands up pretty well in isolation. This is a really good car. And again, at this price point, it just feels like a no-brainer. In any case, that concludes our review of the BYD Seal Dynamic. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and you can join our new WhatsApp channel. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.